with Issa. And he has done many things, clearly. He has spent now 25 years or more at JPL in the Autonomous Systems Division, and he was at times the group supervisor for the Robotics Mobility and Robotics Software Systems Group. And he has many roles, not only within JPL, where of course he is well respected after all the things that he has been able to do and accomplish. But he also, as he just mentioned, is an associate director of the Caltech's CAST. CAST, again, is the Center for Autonomous System Technologies. And also, he is part of the NASA's capability leadership team for autonomous systems. He has done, as I mentioned, many things, including perception-based navigation and manipulation, extreme terrain and microgravity mobility, and he has also, of course, several awards. The Magellan Award, which is the JPL highest award for an individual scientific or technical accomplishment, specifically for his work on extreme terrain mobility. And also, as I mentioned before, I would say he also has the recognition of people around him. He leads several teams at JPL, several missions. I'm sure that he's going to talk about them. And again, thank you, Issa, for agreeing to give this talk. The stage is yours, and take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Alessandro, for the very kind introduction. And Professor Sanfelice, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor, pleasure to be talking to you about autonomy for space exploration. I will focus my talk. I want to give you a little bit of background about JPL, and then I'm going to delve into the topic of autonomy. And if we have enough time, I'll show a few videos from other work related to mobility, but not the focus of this talk. So I'll start off by telling you a little bit about JPL, and I want to kind of take it from the beginning, which is what is autonomy, when do we need it, and why? And this is an important question. Whenever we're in autonomy circles, we don't ask that question. But as Alessandro knows, when at JPL, we always have to be asking ourselves these kind of questions. I will highlight a few things from recent JPL accomplishments in this area. And this is an area that's dear and near to my heart and Alessandro's, which is architecting autonomous systems. And we work. And part of it, I'm going to touch upon principles that are available in the public domain now through publications. I'll touch upon that, give you a little bit of an insight into our thinking in this area and some of the work we did under the DARE project. I will talk about the next steps over the next decade in terms of what are the upcoming missions and where do we anticipate we're going to need autonomy. And I'll wrap up with some thoughts. And given the group, I would encourage people, if you have questions, feel free to ask those questions because I do not see the hands on my big screen here. Feel free to jump in with any questions. To tell you a little bit about JPL, so this is a picture of JPL against in the Arroyo Seco against these nice, beautiful mountains, and we are located in Pasadena, California, and it was founded in the 1930s. That was actually before NASA was founded, which is in the 1950s. JPL is considered a federally funded research and development center. We are managed by Caltech, but we're physically located about 10 minutes from Caltech. Now, you may know some of the work from JPL. So JPL prides itself in terms of having done firsts in space exploration. So if you recall, in the 1950s, the Soviets put the first Earth orbiting satellite, Sputnik. So the US prepared a response, and the first US satellite was called Explorer-1. And the team at JPL is the one that actually developed this. Another first is the first spacecraft that actually flew by Neptune and Uranus. And that was the Voyager 2. And it flew by these in those years, but Voyager actually has been flying it. They launched in the 1970s, and they're still going. The first spacecraft to orbit Saturn with the Cassini spacecraft, but also near and dear to our hearts is the first rover to roam on the surface of Mars, the Sojourner 97, and that's actually the reason why I decided to leave Silicon Valley and come down to JPL. And more recently, with the Perseverance rover, the Perseverance rover is collecting samples on Mars, and these samples are intended to be returned to Earth through another mission called the Mars Sample Return, which you may have heard about. And another first for JPL is the first power flight on another planet, which you may have seen in the news with the Ingenuity. So these are just a few of the highlights from what JPL has done in terms of space exploration.
Excuse me, I was working at JPL in 63 to 65, and they did a Mars flyby, Mariner Mars.
That's right.
Is that the first one?
Yeah,
first
actually,
flyby on Mars?
Yeah, I believe it is. I have a longer chart with many firsts. I think they were like maybe 20 or 30. But for the, I did bring it down to a smaller stat, but
okay.
It very well be. I have to go back and share that slide with you, the full slide. So that's something you worked on. Is that right?
Yeah, I was there 63 to 65.
Excellent. Excellent.
With Charlie Colhays.
Oh, I know Charlie. Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent. So now I want to switch gears and talk about autonomy. And I do want to start with the definition. So when, we talk at NASA, we say, what is NASA's definition for autonomy? So NASA put out that definition in 2018, which is the ability of a system to achieve goals while operating independently of external control. There's a lot behind this. It's a very terse definition, but each word is very significant. And the reason I go to that, because sometimes people interpret autonomy in a different way than NASA interprets it. The first word is system. And in the NASA language, a system doesn't mean machines. A system could also include people. And when we talk about a system making decisions, as an entity here, we refer to a system that's taking an action based on some observation. But that action is independent of some external control. Oftentimes, we think of external control as people on the ground controlling a spacecraft. That's not always the case. So let's take an example. So here, a system could be a robotic spacecraft, like the one I just showed earlier in my earlier slide. And external control could be people on the ground controlling that spacecraft. And that's generally what, in our business at JPL, that's what we primarily do. But when we talk at NASA, that's not the case. Another situation is a system that's a crewed spacecraft going to Mars. So you have astronauts on that spaceship going to Mars. And that the machines and the humans on that spacecraft going to Mars is making decisions independent of perhaps another crew orbiting Mars, or perhaps making decisions independent of the ground operations. So you have, when we talk about autonomy, we have to define what are the boundaries of the system and what are the boundaries of the external control that the system is independent of. For the rest of my talk, I'm not going to touch upon this. This addresses, there's other challenges associated with what you see here, which is how do machines and humans interact to make joint decisions. That's a very important area for NASA, but outside the realm of the work we do at JPL and what I will cover today. So the bottom line is autonomy is a relative term. You're autonomous from what? Now, we often ask the question, when do we need autonomy? Because there are people, there are people who say, well, do we need autonomy to solve this problem? Is there another solution that could be more reliable? So we have to really reflect on this. And there's two criteria, A and B. So starting with A, we need autonomy when there are changes in the environment or the spacecraft, when these changes are not predictable, and when we need to respond before the next communication cycle. When all three are true, then we have no choice, and we're going to need autonomous capabilities. The other part of this is defined by how we set our goals. So you can have two systems, you can have one system, and by just changing the goal definition, that could need autonomy or not need autonomy. Let me describe what I mean. Let's say we're trying to build a rover that's going to go and collect 20 samples from the moon. And let's say I say, you have to do this sample collection in less than a month. And if you look at the communication cycle, the communication cadence, the opportunities, and how much the rover is going to make progress, you may say there's no way you can do that in a month. You can do it in a year, but not possible in a month unless you have autonomy. But if you change that and make it a year, then you may not need autonomy. You can interact with the ground and have the ground help collect those 20 samples. So that's what I mean by where you set the goal also determines whether you need autonomy or not. So really autonomy, the needs for autonomy are driven by three things: the spacecraft, the environment, and the goals that we set. And why this is important is oftentimes when missions are proposed and risk is a key part, people adjust the parameters, they adjust the goals, they adjust the mission duration, which affects cost, such that you decrease the need for autonomy because there's a perceived sense that it could lower risk. Sometimes it does lower risk, and sometimes people perceive that it does lower the risk. Now, I do want to take a perspective is, why do we need autonomy? So if we take a look at from the past to the present and the future, in the past, there's been a large number of spacecraft that's been flown. A lot of them were initially flybys, and then there were orbiters, and some of these orbiters landed, and now we see more sophisticated things done on the surface. We've seen 20 years of exploring the Martian surface with a suite of rovers. And in the future, we're talking about another type of spacecraft, which is the rotorcraft that's developed by Goddard, that's actually going to fly through the atmosphere of Titan. So if we really reflect on the trajectory for the last 60, 70 years, well, what do we see? Whenever we're operating in space, we really have a good understanding of the orbital dynamics. And we have been able to design the spacecraft in a certain way to be very successful. But also we learned once we start landing on planetary bodies, especially for the first time, our understanding and knowledge, despite all the information we have, is always challenged by these space environments. And I'll give you a couple of examples. If you really look at both the InSight and the Phoenix mission, whenever they tried to interact with the surface, there was something that's unpredictable. In the case of the Phoenix lander, which was a lander that went to the North Pole and tried to scoop, the material it scooped ended up far more sticky than anybody expected, and it got stuck to the scoop. Eventually, they got it out, but that was challenging. So the point is that as we interact physically with these surfaces, it becomes much more difficult. And I did touch upon the models. Certain models are, we have the physics and we understand them. Other models tend to be far more complex. Take models that try to understand the interaction of the wheel with the terrain. Terra mechanics models, complex. Try to look at models that understand trying to drill through or penetrate ice at cryogenic temperature, very complex. And then if we look at what's happening on the compute side, we're getting a lot more compute, but one of the biggest challenges is also we have a large and more capable sensing suite. Just consider the cameras that were put on the spacecrafts in the 70s and the 80s, and consider the rover on Mars that's shown in the picture here, that's carrying 17 cameras at very high resolution, 20 megapixel cameras. Big difference in the data volume that these generate. And then, as I touched upon earlier, the forms of these spacecraft, we started with more flybys and orbiters, and now we're seeing a broader set of things like rovers, balloons, melting probes, and so forth. So the argument is that in the past, we've been very successful relying on lower degrees of autonomy because we were able to predict things because of all these factors. And I would make the argument in the future, we're going to need a great amount of flexibility. And that's what's going to drive our need for autonomy. If you want more detail on making the case for autonomy and some of these things, I did list a paper here that captures a lot more details than what I cover here. So let me pause, see if there's any questions so far. Okay, so let me touch upon a couple of highlights. So despite what I just said in the previous slide, there has been a number of things I'd like to highlight in terms of autonomous capabilities. The first is being able to do autonomous capabilities in deep space navigation, in entry, descent, and landing, surface mobility, and above surface mobility. And if you look carefully at this video here, there's this Mars helicopter. So there's a video taken by the rover on Mars with the helicopter conducting its flight. And I do not remember which flight is this. Some people may recall the helicopter was designed to only fly 5 times. I think we are on the order of 50 to 60 flights, and it still keeps going. So let me delve into a few of these. So in the area of entry, descent, and landing, as I mentioned earlier, this is an example where as you land on Mars, the 7 minutes of terror, you have no opportunity to close the loop with the ground, given the communication delays. And this is an area where the spacecraft has to make decisions. It can't wait. And there are changes going on. You're going through the atmosphere. Now, when we started doing this thing, the methodology of landing has evolved over time. So you may remember with the Mars Exploration Rover, the way we were able to land it is slow it down through the atmosphere, deploy the parachute, but eventually we had airbags. We deployed big airbags, and we had the rover in a cocoon, and it was small enough that it could do that. But there was a big worry back then, which is, what about these winds on Mars? And these winds could actually interact with the parachute and create a horizontal velocity that will tear those airbags. So that's when JPL developed this autonomous capability to image the surface and do repeated imagery to estimate horizontal velocity and make a decision based on that observation. That got more sophisticated on the Mars Science Laboratory in 2011, where we did closed loop guidance, navigation, and control. And at that time, we had the larger spacecraft. The most sophisticated landing system culminated in the Perseverance rover that actually not only closed the loop on the guidance, navigation, and control, but did something called terrain relative navigation. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. But to highlight briefly, as the rover is coming down on the parachute, the heat shield from that back shell is discarded at one point, and that allows the spacecraft to observe the terrain. By observing the terrain, we can do more than just estimate the horizontal velocity. Now, we do this for the following reason. We try to bring down the landing ellipse from very large, because the airbags have large uncertainties, 100 kilometers on the major axis, and we try to bring that down to 10 kilometers or less. There's a newer capability we want to do, which is called pinpoint landing, where you can actually use all these techniques, use also hazard avoidance, the hazard detection avoidance, to land within less than 100 meters. That's ongoing work as we speak. So this is the actual data from the landing of the Perseverance rover. And what you see on the left is a picture of Jezero crater. That's the area where the rover was supposed to land. Now, the reason why I see all this red color, these are all the areas where we don't want to land. They're hazardous. But I did mention this landing ellipse is about 10 kilometers in diameter. And as the rover is coming down and observing the terrain, if the predicted spot where the rover will land is in one of those red areas, it will do something called the divert maneuver. And you can see it here. If you can see my mouse, it was going to come down right on the face of this wall, and it did the divert maneuver to a safe area. Now, let me play this one more time, this video. So these are the imagery from the spacecraft as it's landing. And you can see multiple colors. These are features that the system is tracking. And what it's doing is observing these features. And because we've been to Mars before and we have all the orbiter information, we match these features to the orbital maps. And we filter out the outliers. And we basically use that information to tell us where the spacecraft is at every point in time. And it's updating frequently. But you can see the challenges. As you see this big wedge move, that's because the spacecraft is, it's acting like a pendulum a little bit on that parachute. So the field of view and what you observe does change over time. But of course, a lot of the analysis goes into this to make sure that this will be successful under even the worst conditions. And as you can see here, initially it was supposed to land right there. That's where it was projected to land. And it did the divert to a very safe spot. And just to give you a sense of how challenging this was, this is the terrain looking in this direction, where if we landed here, we would have been in trouble. And if we landed on this side, we would have been in trouble. And so we would have been in trouble on this side. So we were pretty much surrounded by hazards. And so that's the terrain relative navigation that was done on the Perseverance rover. Another area that I'm going to talk about is autonomy for surface mobility and navigation. So this is another capability that's similar to what you saw in the area of EDL, has evolved over time. And we started providing some autonomous capabilities on the Mars Pathfinder. So the Mars Pathfinder had a structured light and was able to detect rocks and avoid them. And we used that very sparingly because it was a very short mission. On the MER, Mars Exploration Rovers, that capabilities was used a lot more, but was not yet a required thing for the mission. Fast forward to 2020, we made this capability a lot more sophisticated. We can think and drive at the same time. In the earlier one, we had to stop, take images, think, and then take action. Now we're doing it while we're driving. We can traverse both benign and complex terrain. This capability matured over 20 years and was a requirement for this mission. The mission would not have succeeded if we're not able to drive autonomously. And of course, more work is ongoing in terms of understanding how do we handle more difficult terrain. And so the picture here at the bottom is showing you as we get into more challenging terrain, both the design of the rover as well as the autonomy you use gets more sophisticated. So this is data actually from Sol 122 on the Perseverance rover. And you can see the rover traversing its observed map. And you can see this area has hazards. And these lines are the paths that the rover is thinking about, selecting which ones to traverse on to minimize the hazards in its path. And these are the actual images from the rover on a different Sol. This is Sol 341, and you can see it goes by very quickly, but let me replay that one more time. Oops. So you can see it's going to come up here on the right, where it will see some rocks and avoids them and goes around them. The other capability is really flying the helicopter. And of course, we can't fly the helicopter the same way we operate our spacecraft. So the helicopter has to have a capability to take off, land, and of course, fly to a destination on its own. Of course, there's a ground team helping the helicopter before you take a flight, but during that flight, it is autonomous. Now, as we move forward in terms of capabilities, there are a larger suite of different types of aerial vehicles, or what we call above surface vehicles, because they're not always aerial vehicles. Balloons on Venus. We talked about the rotorcraft on Titan. Now, the helicopter has been a very successful experiment. It was a technology demonstration, and it flew shy of 2 hours for a total of 13 or 14 kilometers probably by now. Let me pause and see if there's any questions on the landing, the roving, or the flying on Mars.
There's a quick question.
Yeah.
Does the computational limitation on board the vehicles ever play a role on your algorithm design?
Absolutely. And it plays a significant role. And the reason why we cannot put, what has been limiting us is not the capabilities necessarily, but precisely 3 things: computation, power, and thermal. And so let me talk about computation. Usually flight processors are about a decade behind what, or even more than a decade behind what we have in terms of COTS computing. And the reason is because they have to be radiation hardened. If you're building a spacecraft, you're very susceptible in space to gamma rays and other what we call single event upsets. Means if you have a computing system, any bit could be flipped. And how can you build a system that's reliable and has to be tolerant to a single failure? Whenever we build what we call a flagship mission, like the rovers, or what we call a Class B mission, these are expensive missions. There are certain requirements we have to meet in terms of we can't just fly any computer. We have to fly a special computer, which are expensive and very limited. Now, the helicopter was an example. The helicopter flew a cell phone processor, a Snapdragon. And the helicopter, which was a technology demo, so we can get away with something called radiation tolerance. It doesn't have to be radiation hard, just tolerance. And we made sure that it will survive, sufficiently survive radiation. But it was a Class D mission, it was a tech demo. And hence, it had more computing than all our missions combined. So that's how the difference between what you could have versus what you typically have on flight mission. The good news is that they're working on a processor and a slew of processors that are far more capable than what we have flown on our Mars missions. So that's going to be an important development over the next several years. But very good question. The other one I want to touch upon is power. So power is really important because we have very limited power in space. And so we have to be extremely efficient in terms of compute power that we use. Okay. So unless there's any questions, let me move on to architecting autonomous systems. Oh, so one of the things I did want to touch upon before I get into that is there's also been a lot of autonomous capabilities to go to small bodies. Now, one thing about small bodies I share with you, what's interesting about them, there's so many of them, first of all. There are about 1 million small bodies in the solar system. They're very hard to reach, but they're also unknown worlds because you can see examples. They all look very different. We don't even know their shape or their rotation axes ahead of time. We have, of course, to know their orbit to some degree. Otherwise, how are we going to get to them? But there's been capability advancements in flying around these things, targeting these, and being able to conduct science experiments in terms of collecting samples from these, which were done with autonomous capabilities. If you remember the DART mission, which was a mission an APL mission from Applied Physics Lab, the JPL participated and did the navigation for, and it was actually able to hit the target binary moon of an asteroid and show that it could divert it or change its orbit. But I told you about all these autonomous capabilities. If you take a step back and look at how we do our missions, and if I look at this blue box as the entire mission duration and the amount of autonomy that we do on board is still fairly limited. So remember, I showed you this autonomous entry, descent, and landing, which is represented by this green box. So that capability we did, the spacecraft was making decisions and so on. But what happens, if you look at this capability, before this capability gets executed, there's a ground team assessing what's going on. That capability gets executed, and the ground team analyzes what's going on. The same thing when we fly a helicopter on Mars. So if you look largely, we're still using a very large operations team to understand what's going on and to help the spacecraft make the right decisions. Think of the future, tomorrow. Can we build spacecrafts that are largely autonomous, that we interact with them? So these yellow boxes here and up there shows our interaction with the spacecraft. And generally, we want to get that spacecraft to its destination, and that's when we want to talk to it a little bit more frequently, but have less frequent communications with it as it goes. Going from where we are to where we want to go in the future is a very difficult endeavor because there's a lot of complexity involved. But ultimately, that's important because it allows us to operate spacecraft with a smaller operations team, which ultimately impacts operations cost.
Imagine.
So I'm going to show you a video, and after that, I'm going to delve into some technical details of some of the work we've been doing to push that from where we are to a future of where we would like to go, which will be, many, many years from now. But let me play this video, which is related to exploring small bodies.
Imagine an autonomous small spacecraft heading to explore a near-Earth asteroid, map it at close distance, land, and roam its surface, all on its own with only limited guidance from Earth. After launching on a commercial rocket, the spacecraft separates, stabilizes itself, and autonomously checks out its instruments, sensors, thrusters, and antenna before it embarks on the 1-year journey. It cruises autonomously to its destination, navigating by using sightings of distant asteroids with its optical navigation camera. At its first sighting of its target, the spacecraft locks its gaze onto the faint-looking body from hundreds of thousands of kilometers away, refining its own location and that of the body as it approaches. With its narrow and wide field of view cameras and powerful onboard computing, DARE starts discovering this unexplored asteroid. DARE estimates the body's rotation rate and uses its dancing silhouette to construct its shape and axis of rotation. As the images of the asteroid grow and show more detail, the spacecraft identifies and tracks surface landmarks, refining its understanding of the body's motion and shape. As it gets closer, the spacecraft reaches a hover point, turns on its near-infrared spectrometer, and starts its scientific mapping of the asteroid. Tracking its progress, it shares an initial assessment of the near-Earth object's maps and composition to the scientists back on Earth. Building a high-resolution global elevation model of the body, the spacecraft identifies possible landing hazards and candidate landing sites to send to the ground for further evaluation. Based on science and engineering information, scientists make the final decision on the landing region. Once a landing site has been confirmed by the ground team, it is time to head to the surface. DARE readies itself for its surface mission and starts its descent, controlling its trajectory and attitude toward the target to minimize rebound, streaming data to the ground for later analysis. After a sequence of anticipated bounces, the spacecraft is now ready to start exploring the surface. It self-rights and images its surroundings, establishing situational awareness. X-ray spectrometer measurements determine elemental composition for ground-truthing orbital maps. The spacecraft charges its batteries and hops to its new destination, looking back to image the patch it departed to understand surface properties. The Deep Space Autonomous Robotic Explorer, DARE, demonstrates a new paradigm in planetary exploration that handles uncertainties of an unknown world across mission phases. It is a stepping stone to more remote and extreme destinations on moons in the outer solar system that might host extraterrestrial life.
So this is a project that we actually been working towards. And we started looking, if we were to achieve something along those lines, what are the things that we need to do? But to guide our work, we went on an effort to start collecting all our knowledge and experience over the last 20 years or 30 years in autonomous systems. We captured them in this document that we socialized internally with a lot of people, and we eventually put out a publication that I put the reference here. And I'm trying to see if we can publish the entire document in its full, hopefully in the future. But the architecting of autonomous systems, we broke it into 3 areas: is principles related to knowledge, information, and knowledge. And some of the things that we emphasize is the explicitness about our assumptions, about our models, and also ensuring consistency of information. And then a lot of it talk about the representation of information, the uncertainty, timing, and synchronization. In the area of reasoning, there are about 10 principles in the area of information and knowledge. In the area of reasoning, it's about understanding the scope of the reasoning, understanding the model limitations, and have a full accountability of all knowledge. And then also connecting the intent to the action that the spacecraft takes. Understanding where we need flexibilities, how do we compose things, and how do we trace things in terms of understanding the actions that were taken. Also ensuring resilience, especially to unknowns and errors that come from multiple sources, including operators. Operators make mistakes like everybody else, system fails, and there are errors in the code. How do you explicitly coordinate and synchronize behaviors and actions? And then the last section is the area of behaviors and actions, ensuring the safety of actions in spite of failures. That's a very important part of what we do. But also, how do we manage the behaviors and action in the system? How do we understand the implications? Not only the immediate actions, what are the implications of a long-term action? If we make a slightly less optimal action in the near term, we may be depleting a resource that we may need down the road. So in more detail, which I'm not going to go through, but I do want to show you the areas. I did kind of highlight these principles. So they break down into, again, information, knowledge, reasoning, and behavior and actions. And each one of these, there's a one sentence principle and a paragraph of rationale with some examples. So if you're interested, I do encourage you to look at the publication. You can learn a little bit more about it. Now let's take a look at, if we want to architect an autonomous system, and we look at the onboard part of it, there are two parts of the system, what we call the reasoning system and the system that's going to be reasoned about. And the system that's going to be reasoned about has multiple subsystems. And there are states within each subsystem. And there's some interaction among these subsystems and between the reasoning system and the system reasoned about. And so how do we describe the models? For the longest time, we've always used some kind of a physical way to manifest the interaction of these states. But now more recently, we've seen a rapid growth in the use of data-driven techniques that allow us to model things that are very difficult to express in these physical formula. What we envision that in the future, our system will be a hybrid of the two. When we do space systems, because the problems are so difficult, we never throw away knowledge that we have, even if it's more difficult to combine the two. But every bit of knowledge is so important when you're in the harsh and extreme environment of space. Now, when we take a deeper look at the system level and the system reasoned about, there are different functionalities. So at the very highest level, we have an execution system. What does that mean? Think of an orchestra, think of the conductor in an orchestra. The execution is the one that's orchestrating the activities within the system. Without that, we rely on the ground operations team to really orchestrate all the activities in the spacecraft, and that's how we largely operate our spacecraft. But also at the highest level, we have to really manage our data because we are collecting tremendous amount of data and we're filling our buffers and our memory and our storage. And we have to also plan our actions and look at the horizon, and we have to manage the health of the system. And all these have to work together to provide that reasoning part that will reason about the different subsystems. There's a lot of things happening at the functional level in the system reason about, and they break down into traditional areas of navigation and attitude control, mobility, communication, thermal, and power. But all of them are equally important because they all consume resources. They're all involved in maintaining the health of the spacecraft, and these are interacting with the physical world. Now let's take a deeper look at this. What's fundamental? What is autonomy about? It's really about control. And if I look at the timeline and I look at the now, control, if I'm trying to control something, I'm estimating and controlling. So I have some kind of a closed loop system that looks at data between the now and the past. An equally important thing for autonomous system is to also look at the future. And the equivalent of that is to be able to predict and plan. And there's symbiosis between the two where you have to predict and plan so you understand the uses of resources, and that will influence your control and estimation. But sometimes it's not as clean cut as I just drawn here. So sometimes we do the estimation and prediction as an integrated capability, and sometimes we have them as separate capabilities. To be able to predict, we have to know what the plan is, because that's how we can use the information to predict. So now I'm getting into a little bit more detailed view here of the reasoning system and the system reason about. So ultimately, what the operations team will send up to the spacecraft in an autonomous system is a plan or a set of intents or what we call goals. And there could be also a set of tasks. And there's slight difference in the definitions that I won't get into here, but I'm happy to answer questions on. And of course, ground will have to get telemetry. Now, in the reasoning system, there's two parts of it, is establishing world awareness and establishing spacecraft awareness, because things could be failing on the spacecraft. There's this third leg to the stool, which is science awareness, which is understanding the measurements and reasoning about them, because these directly tied to the intent of the spacecraft. And you can see the patterns of controller estimators and predictors and planners at the highest level. So there's a highest level closed loop on both sides. And each domain has its own set of predictors and planners, as well as controllers and estimators. So you can imagine a system will have multiple planners and predictors, multiple estimators and controllers at different levels. And the interaction of all these pieces is really what allows this to operate and make decisions without being independent from the ground. And of course, these things interact with the sensors and actuators and the instruments. So a little bit more detailed look in each one of these things that are going to be reasoned about. Take the power system or the thermal system or the motion system. And the motion system consists of the orbit of the spacecraft and the attitude of the spacecraft. There are models that we have. We have a knowledge from our understanding of these different pieces. And these things, again, are doing their own estimation and control, but they all affect one another. And the position of the spacecraft affects the power system because there are solar panels attached. So there's a high degree of coupling among all these things. But that high degree of coupling, together with the models, allow us to reason about the system. And what we call a co-estimation is understanding what's going on with the spacecraft, because not everything will go nominally. So I'll give you an example. Consider a spacecraft attitude system that tells you where the spacecraft is pointing. It typically uses star trackers, and it uses IMUs, inertial measurement units, and it can tell you where it is. Something failed on the spacecraft, and what the attitude estimator is telling you is giving you the wrong information because something broke. But if you look at the power system, which has usually have nothing to do with attitude, you know the physics of the problem. You know the sun is going to hit the solar panel at some angle. You know some model of the solar panel. Then you expect to know that if you are where the spacecraft tells you are, you should see a certain amount of voltage on your solar panel. If you see something completely different, you have two different subsystems providing you information that is inconsistent. So what do you do in this case? How do you reason about it? Do you take additional measurements? So you have to go through a process of reasoning to resolve that conflict and make the right decision, given that your resources may be compromised or some of your subsystems may be compromised. Now, delving one level deeper into one area, which is the area of motion and perception, the problem we just looked in the video is a fairly challenging problem. Why? Because when you start observing your asteroid, your target body you're going to go to, it's going to appear as 1 or 2 pixels. And as you get closer, it's going to start filling the image and extend beyond what you can see. And you have a narrow field of view camera and a wide field of view camera. Of course, you can say, well, why don't you use a LiDAR? Well, LiDARs are usually limited to a couple of kilometers. And usually the approach starts from hundreds of thousands of kilometers. And you have to go through a process of a bunch of functions, perception functions and estimation functions, to be able to assess what's going on. Understanding where the asteroid is, where the center of it, looking at the silhouette, as you heard from the video, to understand what the shape could be, or the bounding part of the shape, which is what we call the convex hull. And then tracking features as the body gets more resolved and you can start seeing features, and you start tracking features and landmarks. Then you build a 3D model of the shape. And remember, you have uncertainties all the way through that you have to deal with. And then you look at assessing the hazards. Where are the safe areas to land, where are not? And the hazards are not just, what the slopes are, and the slopes on small bodies are very difficult because it's non-uniform gravity, right? We're used to uniform gravity, but these have non-uniform gravity. But you have to also look at occlusions. You have to look at thermal hazards because you don't want to overheat. And then you decide on where to land. So all the stuff, there's a lot of functions happening, and all the system level stuff is happening here. And these two are interacting to make decisions. A lot of decisions to be made. Do you take additional images? Do you move from one phase to another? Do you wait and change your orientation and do something else? Do you charge? Do you talk to ground? What do you do on board? Today, we prescript these things. In the future, we hope spacecraft will be able to do that on its own. I know this is a busy chart and there's a lot in it. If you're interested to learn more, there's a publication on this about autonomous approach. I'm happy to share with you the link. So the feasibility of an autonomous approach pipeline, is an important part of being able to go to a small body autonomously. And that's only part of the story. Now, one thing that's actually enabled us to really study these more effectively is the amazing technology around us that enabled us to do things like what you see here. What you're looking at is not a real body. This is not actually a synthetically generated body, starting with the initial shape of Bennu. And then we change that in terms of shape, rock distributions, to whatever we want it to be. And then we use these artificially generated body and rendering to be able to study these techniques that I showed in the earlier slide, and to also compare them to real imagery. Now, so we heavily rely on simulation. And on the simulation, so this is the onboard system here, with the system level capability, the functional level capabilities. And then we have the various subsystems, as well as the simulation. So we have to simulate all these different parts of the spacecraft, the small body, the gravity models, etc., so this can interact. What this chart shows is the different, the green ones. I'm going to show you another video where we actually simulated, developed all these things in green. So we didn't do everything, but we developed a good chunk of this so we can close the loop between the onboard system and this spacecraft. So let me move on to the next video to show you some of the results.
This is a preliminary prototype of DARE's onboard autonomy software running in a simulated environment. The spacecraft is running a system-level executive that executes a simple pre-planned set of tasks with the high-level goal of approaching the 500-meter-sized asteroid along a pre-planned trajectory from 200 kilometers to 20 kilometers. The onboard software executes the tasks in the plan, images the body, determines the relative orbit, tracks the drift in its orbit relative to the body, and uses that information to point the camera at the asteroid. The simulation renders physics-based photorealistic images of the body and simulates the 6 DOF dynamics of the spacecraft, its sensors, and actuators. This integrated system is the first step toward building the onboard autonomy, the simulation environment, and the validation and verification infrastructure. It would provide a testbed to rapidly advance autonomy to handle uncertainties of an unknown world across mission phases.
So one of the things to note in this video is the verification and validation, the assurance of these autonomous capabilities is a very important area. And you have Alessandro, he's our expert in this area. And so that could be a whole talk in itself. And I don't touch upon it, not because it's not important, just because
this is
a huge area that requires a significant amount of attention. Now, let me touch upon a few next steps, and I'll wrap up in a few minutes. A lot of what we do is driven by something called the decadal surveys. And astrophysics, earth science, and planetary science have those. Every 10 years, a group of scientists nationwide get together and try to answer the big important questions for each of these big domains to guide the missions that will come up. So a lot of the work we do and what I talked about today falls under the planetary science, which is exploring everything in the solar system. And when this group of scientists do the work, they commission certain studies, which are different mission concepts. And ultimately, they down select from those many, many studies, a handful of, 5 to 10 missions that they say are important for the future. So what we did in this exercise that you see here is we really studied all these reports, which are publicly available, so you can look at them, and try to understand where the need for autonomy is in the future. And one key area that you see here is the concept called endurance A, which I'll mention in the next slide. And it has a lot of pull in terms, it has a lot of need for autonomy. And there's other ones, it's not the only ones, that you can see the rest of them, which are very interesting missions to go to Enceladus, to go to Centaurs, and to go to other asteroids. Let me tell you a little bit about the endurance mission concept. So the idea of the endurance mission concept is a rover that's going to land on the far side of the moon in the middle of something called the South Pole Aitken Basin. And it's going to land here where the arrow shows. And the reason why this is really important, because that's the largest impact basin in the solar system. And there's something remarkable about the moon. The moon has no plate tectonics, there's no water activities. And so the history of the formation of the solar system is preserved in the rocks in that South Pole Aitken Basin. This has been, for the last 30 years, has been a high priority for the scientists, the planetary scientists, to go in and get samples from this. But it's been very difficult. So the idea of this rover is to come in and land and drive a really long path and collect many samples along the way. That's where you see all these letters. And you bring those samples to the South Pole, and astronauts will come from the South Pole and bring these to Earth. That's extremely exciting scientifically and very important. So that's actually being studied. The challenge here is you have a rover that has to drive 2,000 kilometers and collect 12 samples along the way. How do you do that? That's a very long distance. Just to give you a sense, the record holder for distance is Opportunity at shy of 50 kilometers. So that's 44 times more than what Opportunity did. So, yeah, and I'm happy to answer questions if you have. So let me conclude. I hope I convinced you that autonomy is going to become increasingly critical for remote exploration. And the reason why it becomes very critical, because the resources are very constrained and the environments are getting more challenging. And our ambition in space exploration is we want to go to more interesting places, challenging places, ocean worlds, which are these worlds that are covered with ice crusted that have oceans beneath them. Whenever we go to a place we never visited, there's always large uncertainties that are there. Once we start getting to the surfaces or into the surfaces, going deep into the subsurface is really scientifically important, or getting into extreme environments becomes very challenging. And it does require making decisions in situ when you don't have all the information ahead of time. When you are in physical contact with an unknown surface out there, it's very, very challenging. The physics are very difficult, and there's a lot of unpredictability. Now, artificial intelligence, machine learning, modeling, autonomous systems, V&V assurance, all critical elements to allow us to explore. And that's going to involve reasoning, executing, assessing situations, handling the health of the system. It's just not one area, it's all these areas combined, which is very difficult because you have to cross very many disciplines and you have to understand those things to put such systems together. Now you have to work with experts in these areas, but it is a very cross-discipline field here. And as I mentioned, very important, the assurance of autonomy. So I want to thank you for your attention and also acknowledge that everything I showed you is really the work of a remarkable team of people, many of whom are here in the list, that have contributed to many of these capabilities and concepts over the many years that I've been fortunate to spend at JPL. So I will play this video. So this is, I did talk about the endurance mission has to drive fast for long distances. So this is an example of a rover trying to navigate a pretty difficult field. And we created a bunch of traps here that you can see. And actually it's doing all this navigation autonomously, trying to figure out its way to get to the target. And after this wraps up, I'll show another video I'll play and I'll take questions where so this is still relatively benign terrain, even though it looks pretty rocky here, compared to some of the other areas we want to get to, which are highly sloped areas. So what you see here is just a listing of the capabilities running on board. So I'll play this video and I'm happy to take any questions. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Issa. This is great. And I believe this is when did you work on this one, on this specific rover?
Oh, this one here. So this is called duaxle, which stands for dual axle. I started this in 1999, actually.
Oh, I see.
But as you can appreciate with anything, you know, it takes a long time to, you know, to work on something, because there'll be starts. You'll work on it for a couple of years and then goes dormant. And then there'll be a lot of interest again and then goes dormant. Yeah. So the idea was conceived in 1999 and we developed 3 prototypes. And this actually culminated into a mission concept called Moondiver that you can Google. But unfortunately, it was not selected. It's highly competitive to fly on a mission.
Oh, yes, I imagine. Yeah. Well, let me ask the audience if there are questions. Feel free to ask. Yes, go ahead, Steve.
Thank you for the talk. One of the challenges I found with trying to propose to NASA opportunities is that there is a disconnect between STMD from the robotics side and HRP from the human side. And if one is proposing research into human robot teaming, HRP says, well, it doesn't really help people live in space. It's STMD. It involves a robot. It's STMD's problem. The STMD people are like, oh, it involves a human. It's HRP's problem. And so the end, we have these very important research components about how to integrate the humans, whether they constitute operators in a warehouse in Pasadena or folks in Gateway or a lunar habitat that nobody wants to fund. I'd be interested in your opinions and maybe what strategies could be applied to tackle this sort of institutional blind spot. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for the question. And this is, you know, as with any large organization, and even with, you know, within our organization, a lot of different, there's multiple perspectives on certain things, but ultimately it boils down to how much of a driving need and whether people, you know, recognize the need or they say this need is not immediate. One of the things that to appreciate that there's a lot of demand for resources, and there are very broad set of things that could be done, and there's always a lot of constraints on that. So from my experience, I think my experience is primarily working with scientists, because we work on the science side, and what I found the most valuable thing is to really work with the customer who will care about this capability and have them become the advocates for that. That really helps bring things forward, because they'll always look at technologists as every technology have their own technology. But if you have somebody who's a consumer of that technology advocate for it, I think that would be very valuable. Sometimes when you get into the situation you describe, it may be that they're just trying to give you another avenue to pursue because they did not recognize that this is important, or they don't have the resources to tackle it at the moment. So I don't know if that's helpful or that directly answers your question, but that's the closest I can offer.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I know that Issa has a hard stop in a few minutes because I see a meeting on the calendar. So, but Dayan, go ahead, ask your questions.
Thank you. I carefully watched the diagrams that you presented about the control loops and hierarchical structure. There is like a prediction and control estimation loops there, block diagrams. My understanding that the uncertainty is a big chunk of what is an obstacle for an emission. My question is, why there is no more anticipation of uncertainty in your diagrams?
Yeah.
Even when it comes to neural networks and things like that, there is a sense that they're all about trying to squeeze out what we know. However, it's important to understand what we don't know and then include that in the decision makings as well.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And if you look at the autonomy principles, a lot of them talk about the uncertainty and our, you know, even when you issue something, you know, there may be uncertainty in whether something that you plan in the future, it may not happen. Just because you plan doesn't mean it's going to happen. It's all reflected in the way we handle the state. So when we are actually looking at the states, we have to understand the uncertainty of the state in the past, but also when we project, we understand what is our best expected value of that state and the uncertainty. And we also have to say, a lot of times people make the mistake, and actually there's been historical examples. You say, oh, I'm going to flip the switch in a second. Yeah. And people assume that after that second, that switch is closed. That's not, there's maybe 85% probability it's closed, but there's a 15% probability that got stuck. And you have to account for that in your planning. And that makes the problem very difficult. But it is these type of things that actually happen that you have to, so it's very probabilistic. Yeah. And the tools that we have today are also very limited in what we can do. And so there's tremendous amount of opportunity to help advance this. So it is a very tough problem. And the reason why some of the things we do are limited is because also we don't have all the tools we need. But hopefully what I'm trying to do is bring awareness to the things that we think about, we are challenged with. I don't claim we have the solutions. We all have to work together to come up with the solutions, but I do want to just kind of articulate the things that we've been thinking about.
Well, thank you very much for the talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Issa, I don't know if you have a minute to answer Ricardo's question. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, let me take Ricardo's question.
No, it's definitely okay if you need to go. But again, thank you. I guess I wanted to, since there are a lot of students here, very quickly, what are the problems that you would recommend them to focus on? Or maybe what's the problem that you will say that they should focus on? And then maybe briefly, what opportunities are at JPL for students?
Yeah. So there are a number of opportunities for students, for sure. We are so actually the best opportunities, if there are funding programs that the students can get outside, and they say, oh, I have a fellowship or something that covers my time, but I would love to work at JPL. They go under a different program, so we don't have to fund them, and they can come in, and a lot of people will be interested to work with them because there's a lot of startup projects that are starting that don't have funds. But of course, getting external funding is difficult. So there are student programs that are funded by JPL as well. We are at the moment in a slightly tight time in terms of the resources, but that will likely change. So I would say if there are students that are interested, depending on the area of interest, Alessandro and I can forward these resumes to the right departments and see if there are people who are, there is a match in terms of technical interest. With regard to your questions, what areas? I think the area of autonomous system is an important area, but there's so many sub areas within autonomous systems. I think there are some areas where there's a lot of activity going on, especially in the area of robotics. And robotics is a good one because it allows you to see those uncertainties, to have something to physically interact with. But there's a lot of also opportunities in autonomy for the spacecraft and the connecting of all the different subsystems. And that's not as well established in the community. And so a lot of times we struggle with the intersection of many, many disciplines. And how do we deal with that? So that could be opportunities for new ideas and research along those lines.
Right. So systems, I would say, right?
Systems, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much again, Issa. Even though I know you very well, I really enjoyed your talk. I hope the audience enjoyed the talk as well. And with this, we'll let you go to your meeting. In fact, I will join the meeting as well. And thank you very much again. And thank you, everybody, for participating.
Thank you for the opportunity, Alessandro, Ricardo. It's a great pleasure to share this with you today.
Of course.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great talk.